Star Wars is in an interesting place right now. In 2012, Disney bought Lucasfilm and a new trilogy was announced, and the fan reaction was incredibly enthusiastic. Yet, few months after its final installment released, and no one really talks about it. On the rare chance that people do, it's often that people talk about what the trilogy could have been, and not what it was. I think it's fair to say that the trilogy failed based on word of mouth alone, so I'm going to look into that. Where did the trilogy fail? But before I've answered that question, please keep in mind that there are a lot of good things in this trilogy. There are a lot of things that worked, and a huge number of people put a lot of time and effort into this trilogy. However, this video is about what the trilogy did wrong, not what it did right. So whilst there are many elements of quality in this trilogy, unfortunately I'm not going to be talking about many of them. The other thing I want to say, before we start, is go ahead and subscribe to Mr. Chicken Movies. 80% of all of you still haven't got to it yet, and whilst we finally secured the sacred number, as well as get to 70, let's get to 75 quicker than Phasma did dying. This video is all my own opinion and analysis, of course, so I have concluded that the apocalypse, if you will, is mainly down to 4 reasons. So for some fun, with any apocalypse, there are 4 horsemen, one for each reason. These 4 people I think are mainly responsible for the trilogy's failings, and whilst they dropped the ball, they also achieved some great feats, so please don't go hating them for this trilogy, they just got something wrong. Everyone makes mistakes, so let's take a look at what those mistakes were. Number 1. Boring characters. Why do I love movies? In particular, why do I love Star Wars movies? Is a question I often find myself asking, and the one answer I always come to is because a film can tell a story. No matter how realistic or fantastical it is, it can tell a story and still draw you in. However, this is all provided that the characters we follow are what draw you in. We need interesting or fun or relatable characters that we can follow in their journey and get attached to. Why are people so damn attached to the Star Wars franchise? Luke, Han, Leia, Lando, R2, Obi-Wan, Yoda, Anakin, Ahsoka, Watto. The list of iconic characters from over 40 years of cinematic craft is endless. But what can we say about the next 40 years? So let's start off with Finn. Finn was a highlight of The Force Awakens. He had an arc that hadn't really been done before in Star Wars, he had some great dialogue, and most importantly, he was just having fun interacting with the universe around him. Is it cliched? Sure, but I can give it a pass. I was invested in Finn when he faced his fears against Kylo Ren, and I felt the pain as he paid the price for it. Then there's the other 2 movies that throw this awesome plotline off a cliff. More on that later. But now, Finn's still cowardly, and he doesn't know his place in the galaxy. Again. But now, he's a B-plot of the B-plot. The inclusion of his and Rose's plotline was just clearly an afterthought, and whilst I get where Johnson was trying to take Finn, it just felt like a retread. And then there's the Rise of Skywalker. They made him into a simp. Now, Finn's only purpose is to prompt Rey into explaining things and for cheap comic relief laughs. Remember the multiple times Finn says, "Hey Rey, before I die, I've got to tell this one thing to you." Because I do. Unfortunately, the writers didn't, because they never explained what he was going to say. It literally went nowhere. And it's a shame because ironically, the most active protagonist from the first film in the series just became a weak non-presence by the very end, whose arc finished at the first film and was kind of just left around for the remainder of the trilogy. Next we have Poe. Poe is really just an entertaining side character in The Force Awakens. He's like Han Solo, but in it a lot less. So in The Last Jedi, Rian Johnson frantically realised they needed to give Poe some character development. And what they do with Poe almost works, but unfortunately, Holdo exists. Like this lady, her, I don't buy for 1 second that this is a leader. Nonetheless, the second in command to Leia. Now, Laura Dern is a good actress, but she was not a good choice for this character. We really needed a character who'd seen battle and dealt with a difficult-handed war. That way, Holdo's secrecy and no-nonsense attitude towards Poe could at least be attributed to paranoia, but instead, Holdo just doesn't work in this. I can buy Poe doing something like this given how annoying Holdo is, but I don't think Holdo is meant to be annoying in the way that she is. So anyway, Poe's whole arc in The Last Jedi just isn't that important by the end, as ultimately he doesn't really learn anything from it. And then in The Rise of Skywalker, I actually like what J.J. Abrams attempted. Like, they reveal his past, and he has some arguing with Rey that gives him something to do. But other than that, Poe doesn't go through much. Rose has been talked about to death, so the only thing I'll say is it's exaggerated how much time Canto Bight actually takes up, although, yeah, it is really pointless. Rose is overly preachy, and her kiss with Finn just didn't feel earned at all. But let's just move on from her. Who likes Han Solo? I think we all do, and he's still really well used in The Force Awakens. He's just as snarky and entertaining as ever. Harrison Ford still seems to be really enjoying playing this character, and his moments with Ben were great. Speaking of Ben, most people just agree that Kylo Ren is the best character in the trilogy, me included. His character was conflicted and anxious, which made every choice he made genuinely unexpected. Adam Driver gave an amazing performance. The physicality he gave showed he had a lot of power and angst, but he still didn't shy away from more subtle moments, showing some vulnerability. Subtle moments in his expression and line delivery just added a lot of layers to this character. He made for an intimidating villain, and his unhinged nature just makes him very unique. It makes him stand out compared to the rest of the saga. We rarely get to see vulnerable villains with insecurities like this, so I'm really glad to see it done well. Ironically, the conflict in Kylo Ren's character is just about the only consistent character trait anyone has in this trilogy. But regardless, I bought every decision of his. I bought his decision to kill Han, not to kill Leia, to kill Snoke, on the subject of which I really didn't care for Snoke going into The Last Jedi. In The Force Awakens, he just came across as an Emperor ripoff. So, in The Last Jedi, I actually really liked the choice to kill Snoke. He was just a generic big bad that we'd seen before, and the lack of explanation behind his link to the Sith and his turning of Kylo Ren just made him a really weak and lazy presence, especially since how everyone has pretty much forgotten him now. Instead, they then made him just a weird clone Sith thing that Palpatine made in a jar. I wish I could explain more, but unfortunately Fortnite explained the Emperor's return about as well as the film did. I just don't see why they didn't make it Snoke again, because now the end of Return of the Jedi is pretty much meaningless. From now on, every time I watch Return of the Jedi, I am going to know that Darth Vader turning good and killing the Emperor was absolutely pointless. Darth Vader died for nothing, and Luke Skywalker turning him good was absolutely nothing. Because at the end of the day, the Emperor is still going to survive, the Sith are still going to go on, and instead they're just going to give that baton to someone else to deal with. The Emperor pretty much got obliterated in the heart of the Death Star, and they can't muster any good explanation for how exactly he's alive. The best explanation they gave us for this guy's survival was...
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
Great. The Emperor just does the same stuff he always does again, and now he just looks like a zombie and has magical powers. And now I have to imagine that he boned someone at some point in his life. Is this guy actually just Voldemort? Anyway, he's only there for fan recognition and so that he can cheapen the end of the original trilogy. Speaking of cheapening the end of the original trilogy, Luke. Now, there are lots of things that could be said about Luke, however, I actually really like what they did with Luke in The Last Jedi. However, the fact that a large amount of fans feel betrayed by his handling in The Last Jedi is not great. And he only really has a presence in film 2, so you sort of just forget him at the beginning and the end of the series. Maybe I'll get into Luke in another video, but for now I'll just leave it as a couple of things. This character has changed a huge amount in the decades that have passed since Return of the Jedi, and his arc in The Last Jedi is at least well told, and whilst I think it is very abrasive, it does make some sense and I can see where Rian Johnson was coming from. Alright, speed round of supporting characters. Go! I don't blame Disney for what they did with Leia, it was fine. These characters were cool, these characters were meh, These characters were useless, Lando's only purpose was fan service, Hux was actually kind of fun, Phasma was barely there, and Babu Frick is the 8th deadly sin. And last, we have Rey, the main character of the trilogy. Rey is and always was a blank slate. In a sci-fi fantasy, you need an everyman, an underdog you root for with a goal you relate to, and a lack of knowledge which allows them to ask the questions that you're asking too. Rey really doesn't have anything going for her. When we meet her, she knows how to fly ships, how to use technology, how to fight, the culture, the Force, the current state of the galaxy. So there's already a disconnect because we don't know half this stuff. In The Force Awakens, her arc is that she discovers she can use the Force, but the problem is she doesn't learn it through training or through inciting emotional incidents, but she learns it because she already knows how to use the Force, and it just kinda works when it suits her. When Rey beat Kylo Ren at the end, it was a misdiagnosis as to why it felt wrong. Most people say that Rey shouldn't have been able to beat Kylo Ren. I actually believe that she should have. The problem here is there was nothing interesting about the fact that Rey beat Kylo Ren. Throughout the trilogy, she always shows perfect morality, always making the right choices and never giving in to the dark side. How boring is that? In The Last Jedi, Rian Johnson tries desperately to bring her back down to earth by making her naive and over her head, and it somewhat works, until her naivety ultimately changes Luke's mind, and it shows absolutely no consequences going forward. Her relationship with Kylo Ren was god-awful. At first they hate each other as they should, then Rey tries to make Ben see the light, which works because Rey is always right. In The Rise of Skywalker, they get Rey's arc so wrong it infuriates me. Rey tries to turn Ben good, then she thinks she's turning bad, so she just stops being bad. Then she turns Ben good because she's good at everything, then she destroys the Sith that Anakin, Yoda and Luke failed to kill. Rey just didn't have anything interest or anything else going for her. She wasn't witty or cool, and her lack of flaws just made her inherently unengaging. If your character never struggles with anything, why should we as an audience care? And we didn't. Overall, none of the protagonists really felt like the audience viewpoint. Everyone already knew what the universe was like, and it was never treated with much wonder or fear in some of the darker moments. Ultimately, I just couldn't relate to anyone. The one character I could relate to was Finn in episode 7. There were other good characters that I was invested in the story of, but the main characters, who are the ones that they really needed to stick, it just failed miserably to capture my investment. There was no consistent arc with any character across the trilogy, which ultimately sunk my interest in the characters. Why there wasn't any consistency? Well, let's go through it. Number 2, no consistency between films. The best allegory I could find was that this trilogy is like Kylo Ren's mask. It's there to be a cool feature, then it gets smashed to pieces, and then it gets awkwardly put back together again. It actually makes a lot of sense why this massive set of inconsistencies happened. They wanted to listen to public opinion and fix their films accordingly. Unfortunately, Lucasfilm overfixed things to the point where each film feels like an awkward fanfiction of the last. Force Awakens played it very safe and heavily emulated the feel of the original trilogy. Because of this, it doesn't really clash with what happened in both the originals and the prequels. Last Jedi saw the predictability of its predecessor and went out of its way to shock the audience and become a more open-ended film that pushed the boundaries of what Star Wars could be. Unfortunately, as we found out with the final seasons of Game of Thrones, going out of your way to surprise people doesn't work if the groundwork doesn't support it. Why would you ignore all of the teasing behind Snoke only to not pay it off, and why would you heavily hint at Rey's parentage if there was no plan for where she'd end up? Regardless of whether you like The Last Jedi or not, it is nowhere near where The Force Awakens was stylistically and plot-wise. Then we get to Rise of Skywalker, where now Lucasfilm were absolutely obsessed with damage control. All of the loose ends now had to be tied up, and it was now meant to emulate Avengers Endgame's big epic finale whilst doing so. Now, all of the interpretive elements have to be shut off and closed in a way that doesn't contradict the story so far, except it does. Rey's parents went from hinted Skywalkers to no one to Palpatine's lost clone. Snoke went from a big new villain to a knockoff emperor to a lab experiment. I agree with listening to audience feedback, but when it gets this self-destructive, a line has to be drawn. Visually, it went from energetic and modern like Abrams' earlier Star Trek films in The Force Awakens, to very explorative and artistic in The Last Jedi, to very blue and factory-made like in The Rise of Skywalker. There just was no vision or any overarching ideas, which just sank the trilogy. I'm taken out of each movie because all the 90-degree bends everywhere. Why should I be invested in the story these characters go through when the writers weren't even invested in it? Why did no one look over the trilogy and monitor the direction each film was taking? Why did no one connect them together and stop some of the more out there ideas? Just because it's Star Wars, that doesn't mean it's going to work automatically. Number 3, it has very little to add to the table. What was the point of making a new trilogy? What new ideas or technology had come to warrant 3 new installments in the Star Wars franchise? At the end of the day, none. They made these movies because Disney needed more money. And what we've seen is essentially just the original trilogy again. Except everyone who's seen this trilogy has already seen the originals. Kylo Ren's arc was just Darth Vader again. Rey's arc was just Luke's again. The Resistance and the First Order are just the Rebels and the Empire again. Why not find an interesting new galactic setup? Why not build your conflict over something other than a thing in space that blows up planets? Why have Palpatine be the villain again, trying to turn the hero to the dark side again by asking them to kill him again? It all just melts into one. Because each film in the trilogy is so contradictory to the last one, the trilogy as a whole just fails to make an overall impression. It all feels the same and never separates itself from its predecessors by design. There are but a handful of new things in this trilogy. Finn's arc of a stormtrooper turning good, Luke accepting the flaws of the Jedi, and the concept of Force FaceTime. But these few ideas are just dwarfed by a needless amount of the same old things, and it was completely intentional. On the subject of this, the whole trilogy feels pretty dour and joyless. There's not much charm or energy or even that much comedy anymore. The films are too busy trying to be serious that they forgot why Star Wars works. Star Wars is for everyone. Children, adults, men, women, people that like sci-fi, people that like comedy, people that like an adventure. In 1977, Star Wars was a worldwide phenomenon because it was able to capture the imagination of so many people due to how accessible it was. What will people remember this trilogy for? Well, the answer to that is nothing, because Disney was never really trying to do anything new. The reason I pinned this on Kathleen Kennedy is because she is the head of Lucasfilm and she produced all 3 of these movies. With a producer of a big franchise like this, you need someone who's going to guide the direction of the trilogy. But Kathleen Kennedy didn't really do any of that. She just let the filmmakers do whatever the hell they wanted as long as it followed by what she felt worked. And because of that, it just was very unambitious. There was no vision, there was no idea. As a whole, this trilogy just felt very uncreative as an endeavour, because it was just designed to milk Star Wars. There are 3 R2-D2s in this trilogy. What's the point of that exactly? Number 4, over-reliance on nostalgia. Star Wars makes a huge amount of money, so of course Disney would milk the hell out of it. The problem with the milking the hell out of it is they only really milked one very heavily saturated part of the franchise, the original trilogy. The plots of all 3 films in the sequel trilogy are taken from each respective film in the original trilogy. The character roles are incredibly similar to the original trilogy, and most annoyingly, there are constant references to the OT. Hey look, it's Lando! Hey look, Endor! Look, it's Nien Nunb! Look, the Falcon! Look, Wedge! Look, Yoda! Look, this message! Look, it's this line! It gets so frustrating because as a fan of Star Wars, I recognize every reference made, and it just comes across as so transparent. They clearly are only referencing these things to gain cheap enjoyment and respect from fans. Hey, we pay attention to the fans, we understand the Star War. The problem is they just haven't put any work into those references. Likewise, most of the designs are really boring. They're just OT designs but with new paint jobs or minute differences. X-Wings, Star Destroyers, Stormtroopers, Desert Planet, TIE Fighters, super weapons. there are barely any original designs, and of those, none of those take the forefront. Nostalgia baiting is just so blatant in this trilogy, which is weird because before now I was blaming the prequels for doing such a thing. But looking at the prequels now, I can actually see that there were several unique designs that they came up with in that trilogy. Some were completely original, like the Jedi Starfighters or the Republic gunships, and others were reworkings of old designs to make it look like the technology had just progressed forward. This trilogy, not so much. It's just so blatant, but the most annoying part is that they're cutting out character development and story for the sake of throwing ultimately pointless references in your face. Star Wars fatigue is a phrase that began to spread around early 2018. This is because Last Jedi, Battlefront 2, Rebel Season 4, and Solo all released within like 6 months of each other, and the problem is they all relied on our nostalgia of the original trilogy. And they all released within 6 months. They just felt like cash grabs, and they tugged at the recognition of Star Wars iconography too hard. It doesn't help that, by design, all of the Disney Star Wars projects just feel tonally the same. The sequels, for the most part, the pioneering series, never took any risks, and if they did, they would retcon those risks anyway. Star Wars is a safe franchise in terms of audience appeal, however eventually people will just get tired of constantly having movies, adverts, posters and toys shoved under their noses, especially when it all looks and feels pretty much the same. I can't believe I'm saying it, but Disney managed to make Star Wars boring. So yeah, ultimately the sequel trilogy failed, and if I could come up with one summary for why each part failed, I would say it's just the lack of ambition. Nothing really about this trilogy spoke to me like they were ever trying to make anything above subpar. Star Wars is amazing, yet this trilogy just speaks of utter laziness. People weren't really trying with the characters or the direction or the story, and because of that it just fell into very forgettable sludge. But at the end of the day, it still did give us more Star Wars. When it was announced I was so excited, little did I know I'd be let down. But the whole trilogy's management is just bizarre. With the financial failure of Solo, EA controversies, and a constant slew of behind-the-scenes woes, Star Wars is in a sorry state, largely due to the failure of its headline series, the sequel trilogy. It's a real shame because there are some amazing things here and so many hard-working and talented people contributed to this trilogy. The good news is, Lucasfilm may have finally learnt its lesson. The Mandalorian and Clone Wars Season 7 were both excellent. EA fixed Battlefront 2, and they've also released Jedi Fallen Order, which really captures the magic of Star Wars whilst also being self-contained. Top talent like Taika Waititi and Kevin Feige are now working on films, and after a lot of campaigning from the fans, projects like Kenobi and the Old Republic are finally in development, showing that ultimately Star Wars is far from gone. So whilst maybe we didn't have the greatest road there, and this trilogy did miss the mark, many years later I'm sure a new series of fans that grew up with this trilogy will emerge, much like fans of the prequels have emerged. Fan conversation about these movies kept Star Wars alive, and now, looking at the road ahead, one thing is very clear. The fans are what have been and will continue to keep Star Wars alive for a long time, and this is because ultimately, the movies are not what makes Star Wars, neither is any one person involved with the trilogy. Instead, it's all the passion that comes from the fans that makes Star Wars Star Wars. Plus, LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga looks pretty great. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe, like and comment, and may the Force be with you, always.